In Louisiana, beauty has a name, Belle Rêve. In French, beautiful dream. It's a name that promises peace, rest, and recovery. But in 1902, in the humid and isolated swamps that surrounded the property, this name became a lie. Belle Rêve became a nightmare from which 45 of its souls would never, ever awaken. And the proof of this horror did not come from rumors or legends whispered around a fire. It came from an official document, cold and clinical, a medical record. A single medical record, whose first line was already a death sentence. Inaugurated with great fanfare in 1898, the Belle Rêve Sanatorium was not just a hospital, but a symbol of the Gilded Age of the South, an era of opulent facades and well-kept secrets. Financed by a consortium of the wealthiest families in New Orleans, its neoclassical revival architecture, with its Ionian columns and sprawling verandas, was designed to impress and intimidate. The gardens were a masterpiece of geometry, with rose beds and marble fountains that imposed a strict order upon the landscape. But this order was a fragile illusion. A few meters from the trimmed lawns, the swamp began, a tangle of cypress trees and dark waters, a world of untamable nature that seemed to watch the sanatorium with an ancient and hungry patience. In command of this outpost of reason was Dr. Alistair Moreau, a man in his early 40s, tall and with an impeccable posture, whose gray eyes seemed to analyze everything with a disarming calm. His reputation, built in the universities of Paris and Vienna, was that of a prodigy, a pioneer of the mind. For the families who hired him, he offered the most precious commodity, discretion. In Belle Rêve, the family embarrassments, melancholy, hysteria, alcoholism, inconvenient sadness, would not just be treated, but erased, allowing the patients to return to society, pure and functional. The medical record that documented the fall of this empire of reason begins in a clinical, almost mundane way. But upon reading the stories of the first victims, we realize that what Moreau called illness was simply life in its most tragic forms. Victim number 1, Jean-Luc Boudreau. Moreau described him as a 52-year-old man suffering from deep melancholy with catatonic tendencies. The record fails to mention that Jean-Luc was a sugarcane farmer whose hands were a map of hard work, or that a fungus, the sugarcane rust, had turned his prosperous field into a graveyard of dry, reddish stalks in a single season. It doesn't mention that his wife, Hélène, died of typhoid fever 6 months later, leaving a silence at the dinner table that was louder than any scream. Jean-Luc's catatonic state was petrified grief. He was committed by his sister, who could no longer bear to see such a strong man turn into a statue of pain. In his first and only note about Jean-Luc before his death, Moreau wrote, "The patient demonstrates a severe disconnection from reality, a chemical failure that prevents the processing of grief. Sadness, when left untreated, becomes a poison to the mind." Victim number 2, Elodie Vance, 19 years old, diagnosed with hysteria with delusions of grandeur. Her delusions were dreams of attending Vassar College in the north and becoming a poetess. Her hysterical fit was a heated argument with her father, a cotton baron, when he informed her of her arranged engagement to a widowed business partner twice her age. Elodie was found in her room reading Walt Whitman, an act her father considered the height of rebellion and mental instability. In her diary, later recovered, Elodie wrote, "Father says that poetry is a disease in a woman's mind. He will send me to Dr. Moreau so that he can cut the words from me as if they were a tumor." In Moreau's notes, Elodie's intelligence is pathologized. The patient exhibits a hyperactive imagination and a refusal to accept her appropriate social role. These literary fantasies are a clear symptom of a wandering womb affecting her judgment. Victim number 3, Samuel Croft, 32 years old, a veteran of the Spanish-American War. His diagnosis, early post-traumatic dementia. Samuel fought in Cuba. A mortar blast left him with a small scar on his temple and a brain that had been wiped clean. The record doesn't describe the weekly visits from his wife Anne, who brought pecan pie, his favorite. She would tell stories of their courtship, their wedding, the birth of their daughter. Samuel would listen with a polite smile and at the end, thank the kind lady for her visit. Each visit was a new stab to Anne's heart. Moreau saw Samuel not as a wounded hero, but as a broken machine. "The Croft case is fascinating," he wrote. "Consciousness seems intact, but access to the memory archives has been irrevocably corrupted. A valuable study on the mechanics of identity. To Moreau, they were 3 case studies, 3 defective minds to be observed. Then, they died. And the way they died transformed his scientific study into a diary of horror. His note after Jean-Luc's death is purely clinical. Cause of death, cardiorespiratory arrest. Remarkable, however, is the complete absence of agonal rigor mortis. The facial musculature is relaxed in an expression of serenity, a physiological anomaly that merits further study. After the death of Samuel, the 3rd case, the tone changes. Curiosity becomes suspicion. The 3rd occurrence of what I am provisionally calling serene death syndrome. The probability of coincidence is now statistically negligible. The hypothesis of an unknown and fast-acting pathogen is now my main line of investigation. But it was after the 7th death, that of a depressed widow named Isabel, that Moreau's wall of reason began to crumble. The medical record shows a burst of activity, toxin tests, analyses of the water, the food, the air, the linen fibers. Everything came back negative. Science, his only religion, was failing him. His handwriting, usually so controlled, becomes more angular, more pressed into the paper. In a note written late at night, frustration gives way to a primordial fear. All logical paths lead to a dead end. It is not a poison. It is not a disease. The pattern is too perfect, too silent. It seems less like a biological failure and more a transition, a form of submission, a voluntary surrender. And something is watching this process. I feel it. On the night rounds, in the silent corridors, in the morgue, there is a presence, an intelligence. I am not alone in my observations. He stops, the pen hovering over the paper. Then, as if a confidence to himself, he adds the note that redefines the entire mystery, transforming it from a question of what to a question of who. He is watching. The word he altered the nature of Moreau's investigation. The medical record ceased to be a log of serial deaths and became the diary of a surveillance. Moreau, the hunter of an invisible pathogen, now felt like the prey. His behavior changed drastically. He began sleeping on a cot in his office, surrounded by medical books that now seemed useless. The night rounds became vigils, where he no longer observed patients for symptoms, but rather the shadows in the corners of the rooms, searching for the form of the observer he felt hovering over his domain. The staff saw their director, once a figure of unshakable authority, now muttering to himself, his eyes fixed on empty spots in the hallways. To understand Moreau's obsession with order and the subsequent horror of its loss, we must go back to his training. In Paris, he was one of the protégés of the legendary Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Moreau witnessed Charcot's famous presentations, where hysterical patients were hypnotized before an auditorium of doctors. But where Charcot saw a window into the complex interplay between trauma and the body, Moreau saw only the ugliness of disorder. In a letter to his father, he described a case that marked him deeply, a young peasant girl named Cécile who suffered from seizures and paralysis. Moreau wrote, Charcot delights in exhibiting the spectacle of suffering, cataloging every scream and contortion. He calls it science. I call it failure. The question is not to understand why Cécile is broken, but how we can make her whole again. Illness is a stain on the tapestry of the mind. My calling is not to study it, but to cleanse it. This philosophy defined him. He was not a healer. He saw himself as a purifier. And now in Belle Rêve, a stain was spreading, and he was powerless to stop it. While Moreau's reason was slipping away, another mind, more pragmatic and empathetic, began to work. Nurse Adeline Giraud did not accept the silence. The death of Elodie Vance, the young poet, had personally affected her. Adeline kept a small notebook where Elodie had shown her one of her poems, a verse about a caged bird that dreams of a sky it has never seen. To Adeline, Elodie's death was not a serene cessation. It was the final silencing of a spirit that only wanted to fly. She did not suspect murder. Not yet. She suspected negligence, a terrible mistake being covered up by the famous doctor's reputation. Her investigation began subtly. During her long hours, she talked to the other staff members. From the laundresses, she learned that the victim's sheet showed no signs of night sweats or illness. From the cooks, she confirmed that everyone ate the same food. With the orderlies, she mapped the deaths. They all occurred in different wings, making a localized contagion unlikely. The fear among them was palpable. The older staff of Creole and Cajun origin began to whisper about the Tian, or the cauchemar, a swamp spirit, a legend used to scare children, but which was now discussed with deadly seriousness in the kitchens and locker rooms. They hung small bags of salt and garlic over the doors of their quarters, a folklore that Moreau would have scoffed at, but which now seemed as logical as any scientific theory. Moreau, for his part, made one last, desperate attempt to find a rational answer. He locked himself in his laboratory for 3 days, focusing on the poison hypothesis. The medical record contains a section titled Experimental Toxicology Protocol, Belladonna. It is a cold and methodical document. Moreau details the administration of increasing doses of the extract to rabbits, observing and recording every symptom. The reading is disturbing. Test 4B, Subject C, dose 10 cc, onset of spasms in 2 minutes, signs of extreme agony, high-pitched vocalization, cardiac arrest in 7 minutes, pupils dilated, but the body is contorted in a mask of terror. At the bottom of the page, a conclusion underlined twice. The poison hypothesis is dead. The causative agent does not inflict pain. It removes it. It is not something added to the body but something offered to the soul. This conclusion was the end of Alistair Moreau, the scientist. By closing the door of logic, he found himself trapped in a dark room with his invisible observer. For Adeline, the dead end of her conversations led her to the only remaining source of information, Moreau's own private records. She knew it was a monumental risk. To be discovered would mean the end of her career, and, possibly, her own commitment under some pretext. On a stormy night, while the sound of rain and thunder muffled her footsteps, she used a master key, which she had copied from a janitor, to enter the director's office. The air was heavy with the smell of tobacco and dread. She wasn't looking for a weapon or a vial of poison. She was looking for an answer, and she didn't find one. Instead, she found madness. On the desk, under the desk, in organized stacks, were hundreds of sheets of paper. Each one contained the same drawing, done with varying degrees of pressure and fury. A complex symbol, half spiral, half eye. This was not proof of a crime, but the map of a man's obsession. Adeline felt a chill. What if the danger wasn't a murderer, but the director's own madness spreading through the sanatorium like a mental plague? She was about to leave when she saw, on the desk, an architectural plan of Belle Rêve. A section in the basement, originally designated as long-term storage, was circled in pencil. Driven by an intuition she couldn't explain, Adeline knew she had to go deeper. With an oil lantern in her trembling hand, she descended the stone stairs to the damp basement. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth and something else, an odor of forgetfulness. Following the plan, she found a solid wooden door in an area of the basement that hadn't been used for years. It was locked, but the wood around the lock was splintered, as if it had been forced multiple times. Using her shoulder, she managed to push it open with a loud, protesting creak. Adeline raised the lantern, her heart pounding against her ribs. The yellow light danced into the darkness and revealed something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't shelves of forgotten supplies. It was the walls. From the packed earth floor to the cobweb-covered ceiling, every inch of all 4 walls was covered in the same symbol she had seen in the office. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, scratched into the wood, into the mortar, one on top of the other, like the silent screams of a mind shattering apart. She was at the epicenter of Dr. Moreau's obsession. The air in the basement room was frigid, a cold dampness that came not from the earth but from the very silence of the place. Adeline Giroux, lantern held high, took a step inside. The beam of light danced across the walls, and the symbols seemed to squirm, to multiply in the flickering darkness. The smell of ozone, like a recent lightning strike, hung in the air. In that instant, Adeline understood with a terrible clarity. This was not the work of a madman. The repetition, the overlapping, the fury contained in some strokes and the calligraphic precision of others. This was a work of devotion. This was a chapel, and she was desecrating sacred, profane ground. As she looked at the central symbol, larger and deeper than the others, the memory of her grandmother, a traiteur healer, came to her mind. She remembered a story told in a low voice on a stormy night, a legend that children were not supposed to hear. It wasn't about the rougarou or the feu follet monsters of the swamp. It was about something older, nameless, which her grandmother called only le donneur de paix, the giver of peace. The legend said that the very land of Louisiana was steeped in an ancient sorrow, It was a land that had absorbed the suffering of native peoples decimated by disease, the agony of slaves worked to death in the cane fields, the pain of countless victims of yellow fever. In certain places where this pain was more concentrated, a cold and passive consciousness could awaken. Le donneur de paix was not an entity with form or malice. It was described as a vacuum, a walking silence, a force of natural balance. Where it found acute and hopeless suffering, it offered an exchange. It did not ask for your soul, it did not demand worship. It just offered an end to the pain, to the memory, to the burden of existence. A beautiful dream from which one did not wake, for there was no one left to dream. In return, the energy of that life, the heat of that suffering, was simply reabsorbed by the earth, closing a cycle. The symbol, the legend said, was the channel, the formal request. It was knocking on a door that once opened could never again be closed. Adeline backed out of the room, the horror of the legend superimposing itself on the reality of what she had found. Dr. Moreau was not killing his patients. He was, in his twisted mind, offering them the ultimate cure. While Adeline's understanding blossomed in the basement, Moreau's medical record documented his complete submission. The scientific notes disappeared, replaced by observations about his new collaborator. He no longer called it he, but rather the giver or the silent physician. One entry read, Observation 28. The giver seems to favor those whose will has been crushed. It ignores anger, frustration, hope. It is drawn to resignation. It is a predator of the spirit that has already surrendered. In this, its efficiency is impeccable. Another, even more disturbing, revealed his attempt at interaction. I spent the night in room 207 after patient 37's transition. The cold was extraordinary, an absence of heat that was physical. I felt the presence. It is a vast, ancient intelligence and utterly indifferent to our concept of morality. There were no words, but an understanding, an offer. The peace it provides is a seduction of a monstrous purity. How can medicine, with its needles and confinements, compete with the promise of absolute nothingness? Moreau was no longer a scientist studying a phenomenon. He had become the high priest of a new and terrible form of therapy. He now facilitated the process. His notes indicate that he would identify the ready patients and spend time in their rooms, discreetly drawing the symbol on the back of a drawer, or simply focusing his intent, opening the door for the giver of peace to make its offer. Adeline knew she couldn't just run away. To leave that place would be to condemn all the other patients. Driven by a sense of duty to the memory of Elodie and the others, she made the decision that would seal her fate. She had to confront him, no longer to expose him, but to understand him, to try to stop him. She found him in the West Wing, coming out of the room of a young man with tuberculosis. The air in the hallway was frigid. The silence was profound. She did not scream. With a steady voice, despite her racing heart, she asked, "Is it over? Have you made your offer to him?" Moreau turned slowly. There was no surprise in his eyes, only an infinite weariness and a deep sadness. "Nurse Giroux," he said softly, "you were always too intelligent, too curious. Compassion is a heavy burden to carry in this place. What have you done?" she insisted, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "I gave them what they wanted, what we all deep down want." "Silence," he replied. "You have opened the gates of hell," she whispered. Moreau gave a small smile, the first she had seen in months. It was a smile of genuine disagreement. "On the contrary, nurse, I have opened the gates of paradise, a paradise of oblivion. The giver of peace is drawn to the knowledge of pain, as much as to the pain itself. And you, Adeline, you now know and have seen too much. You carry the burden of them all. Your suffering is now the greatest of all within these walls." In that moment, Adeline felt it. The intense cold, the sudden drop in air pressure, the silence that was not just an absence of sound, but a presence. She looked into Moreau's eyes and saw that he was no longer speaking to her. He was making the introduction. The medical record does not describe a struggle. There is no murder report. The final entry for patient 44 is the most chilling of all for its simplicity. Moreau's handwriting, trembling for the first time with what seems to be a genuine emotion, perhaps remorse, records, "Nurse Adeline Giroux, found in her room, cause of death, identical to that of the 43 previous victims." She also smiled. But before she departed, before the silence, she looked at me with a terrible clarity. Her lips moved. She did not whisper my name with anger. She whispered it with pity. She whispered the name of the one who was to be next, the name of the only person whose suffering could now close the cycle I had begun. Below this note, the page ends. The reader of the record, with their heart in their throat, turns the page, expecting the description of the next victim, but the next page is almost entirely blank. On it, in a handwriting now strangely calm, formal and resolute, like a signature on a contract, are only two words: Victim 45, Alistair Moreau. The revelation that Dr. Alistair Moreau was the final victim is not the end of the story. It is the key to it. He did not leave a body to be examined on a morgue table. He left a testament. Beside his chair, on the mahogany desk, perfectly aligned with the medical record, was a 12-page letter, written in the same firm and precise handwriting of his early days at the sanatorium. It was not a suicide note. It was a manifesto, a final thesis. The letter began thus: "To whoever reads this, do not assume that these are the ramblings of a sick mind. On the contrary, this is perhaps the only truly sane conclusion I have reached in my entire career. What occurred at Belle Rêve was not a tragedy. It was the successful application of a radical therapy. It was not an outbreak of disease, but an outbreak of healing. I did not summon the giver of peace. No man could. I now believe that it has always been here, dormant in the sorrow-soaked soil upon which this sanatorium was foolishly built. Belle Rêve, with its unprecedented concentration of despair, fear, and pain, did not become its home. It became its symphony. We awakened it with our suffering. I was merely the first to have the courage to listen to its music. Modern medicine, in its arrogance, strives to prolong life at any cost, often prolonging only the agony. We see death as a failure, but after witnessing the first transition, I realized that the failure was my own philosophy. Why struggle to mend a broken mind when complete release is an option? Why treat pain when you can eliminate it entirely? I did not become a murderer. I became a shepherd guiding my flock from the barren field of suffering to the silent valley of nothingness. It was an act of mercy on a scale that history has never seen. Nurse Giroux, her death was a miscalculation, a pity. Not her death, but her curiosity. She did not need to know. Her compassion was an anchor that tied her to a world of pain from which my patients were escaping. Upon discovering the truth, she burdened herself with the suffering of all 43 who came before her. In that moment, her burden became the greatest of all, and the giver of peace, in its impeccable and indifferent logic, made her the offer. She could not refuse. And now only one patient remains in Belle Rêve: me. I carry the weight of 44 transitions. The knowledge of what I have done, the memory of each smiling face has become my incurable disease. The giver of peace is methodical. It does not leave a job unfinished. It has made me its offer. The syringe beside me does not contain poison. It contains consent. My formal acceptance of the treatment. Do not consider this a death. Consider it a graduation. My beautiful dream, at last, awaits me. Dr. Alistair Moreau. A week later, Sheriff Jacques Broussard, a pragmatic man with no patience for the fantasies of the New Orleans elite, broke down the gates of Belle Rêve. The mail was piled up, the telephone lines, dead. He expected to find a sanatorium in crisis, perhaps abandoned. Instead, he found perfect order and absolute silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to have sound. There was no buzz of insects, no song of birds in the impeccable gardens. It was as if the very air was dead. Accompanied by his young and terrified deputy, Broussard went from room to room. The scene repeated with nightmarish precision. Patients in their beds, in their chairs, in the reading rooms, all dressed, neat, and all smiling, not the rictus of strychnine poisoning, but a smile of genuine, deep, and disturbing peace. There were no signs of struggle, of violence, of panic. The beds were made, the books, open in their laps. It was as if everyone had simply stopped in the middle of a moment of happiness. The final discovery was in the director's office. Moreau was sitting in his leather chair facing the window that overlooked the swamp. He too was smiling, his face pale and serene. On the desk, the medical record and the letter, waiting to be read. The deputy vomited in the bushes outside. Sheriff Broussard, a veteran of 2 wars, just sat on the porch steps and lit a cigar, waiting for the men from the capital to arrive. He knew this was far beyond his jurisdiction. The arrival of the health officials from the state of Louisiana was swift, and the operation secret. Faced with an event impossible to explain and with the potential to cause mass panic, a decision was made in a secret meeting in Baton Rouge. The truth would be buried deeper than any body. The official diagnosis, forged and distributed to the press, was an outbreak of a rare and extremely virulent strain of meningitis, which caused paralysis and a spasm of the facial muscles. The 45 bodies were cremated. The records of Belle Rêve were classified as a biological hazard and sealed for a century. The sanatorium was closed, condemned, and left to be devoured by the swamp, becoming a forgotten footnote in the history of medicine, until the historian Thomas Devereux found the metal box, almost 100 years later. As he closed the leather cover of the medical record, the late afternoon light filling his dusty office, Devereux was left with the question that echoes to this day. What was more likely? That a genius doctor went mad and managed to poison 44 people in a way that left no trace, creating a fantastic narrative to justify his acts before taking his own life? Or that he, in his arrogance and desperation, had truly found and opened a door to something ancient, something that operates under laws our science does not understand, a force that offers peace at the cost of our existence? The true story of Belle Rêve is not about ghosts or monsters. It's about how history is constructed, about how inconvenient truths are systematically erased and replaced with simpler, more palatable narratives. How many other meningitis outbreaks or accidental fires in asylums, hospitals, and prisons of the past hide truths that were simply too terrible to be told? The horror of Belle Rêve is not that 45 people died. It is that, if not for a loose floorboard, we would never have known they even existed.